peace, love, and understanding were in vogue, I would be a historian. I don't need to tell anybody here that there's so many injustices in the world today that I'm a peace activist, but an amateur historian. And I also save as much information as I can of actions, conferences, etc. Because if we don't save peace and justice history, nobody else is going to do it for us. I laugh when people talk about Reagan being one of the greatest presidents we ever had. It's just, preposterous, but if you weren't there, you might not understand. One correction to what Ann said about me in my illustrious career, I do not engage in civil disobedience. I think everybody in the room knows the classic definition of civil disobedience. I engage in civil resistance. And Ann brought the Bible, Francis Boyle's Defending Civil Resistance Under International Law. He's an international law expert up in Champaign, Illinois, University of Illinois. So I'm going to talk today about activities in the courtroom where we try to make these issues that my two colleagues had talked about, but bring it into the courtroom. And so we engage in civil resistance, with the concept being, if you say I committed civil disobedience, you just did the prosecutor's work because you've pled guilty. But if you say I have engaged in an act of civil resistance, what you're doing is you're bringing out that you have a Nuremberg obligation to speak out if somebody else is violating the law. It could be the National Security Agency, it could be the Pentagon, it could be a corporation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we try to do after an arrest that eventually goes to trial. And I'm going to give you some historic trials that took place in the movement. This was August 10th of '84. There was the Sperry software pair. I know both of them, Barb Catt and John LaForge. They went to this weapons contractor, in fact, a nuclear weapons contractor in Minnesota. They dressed up as quality inspectors, got in, and then did what we call a plowshares action, where they hammered and poured blood. And in their particular case, they wound up before a judge called Miles Lord. And Miles Lord allowed them to introduce a necessity defense, which is almost unheard of if you go before any judge. The necessity defense, basically, the baby was in a burning building, you broke the window, you were trespassing to get in to save the baby. So Miles Lord actually allowed them to make that argument. It didn't help with the jury, they were convicted, but he refused to give them a sentence. And this was back in prehistoric times. I actually saw both of them and Miles Lord on 60 Minutes, back in the days when there was no Fox, no cable, et cetera, et cetera. Times have changed, though. Another classic case was what happened at the University of Massachusetts with Amy Carter, Abby Hoffman, and 14 others. Does anybody know of this case that I'm going to tell you a little bit about? Anybody familiar with this case? There was a recruiter from the Central Intelligence Agency on the University of Massachusetts campus. And Amy was a student at the time. Her father was president. And Abby Hoffman and others organized an action to get rid of the CIA, saying that was a criminal organization. You can't bring the mafia on campus to recruit students, so why should you be allowed to bring? And lo and behold, in that case, and I'll never forget this, but it was on the nightly news, I saw the jury. These were 6, average Western Massachusetts people. They found them not guilty. The reason they were found not guilty is because they were allowed to bring in expert testimony. They were allowed to make some of the arguments my colleagues were making. Very, very, very rare to happen. But they were found not guilty by these 6 citizens who probably knew nothing about it. But the presentations by people like Ellsberg and Howard Zinn. Does anybody know of the classic Winooski 44? Does that mean anything to anyone?
Could you repeat that?
Winooski 44. These folks I've done sit-ins in my day, but I don't think I've ever done a 3-day sit-in. They did 3-day sit-in at a Republican senator's office in Vermont and wound up in court. And 26 of them went to trial. The others paid out. And in that particular case, again, because of the judge allowing necessity defense arguments to be presented, etc., the 26 that went on trial were acquitted by jury. Well, I don't know if I knew any of the Winooski 44 back as Barb Larkin was talking about. They were protesting the Contra War. That's what the sit-in was all about, because their senator was voting in favor of giving money to terrorists. They were killing people in Nicaragua. So more recently, some of my friends went to Vermont Yankee. It's a nuclear power plant in Vermont, and it's, the pollution is enormous from it, and anyone that knows anything about nuclear energy, there's no such thing as safe radiation, or this plant is safe, this one isn't, et cetera, et cetera. So they actually went to Vermont Yankee and chained themselves to the doors, et cetera, and then wound up in trial, again in Brattleboro, Vermont. In this particular case, the judge would not allow any necessity defense, any talk about Nuremberg obligation or any of that, and so they were convicted. The judge wanted to give them community service, and this is something we usually say if we're being offered community service. We've already done our community service by sitting in the senator's office or going to the Pentagon or wherever. So he refused to. They're all the 6 women were all grandmothers. He refused to put them in jail. Steve here, who is doing the videotaping, I think this was your first arrest at the Pentagon on April 8th of 2011.
That's true.
It was his first arrest. And just in case any of you want to join us at protesting at the Pentagon, there's lots of opportunities, just in case. And if it's your first arrest at the Pentagon, it's a freebie. You will not be charged. So in this case, there were 26 of us that went to the Pentagon, and they were out of control that day, to say the least. If you know Eve Taytaz, they knocked her to the ground. Joy first, they knocked her. They were just out of control that particular day. And 8 of us were recidivists. I've been to jail a number of times over my 70-arrest career, and I just haven't learned the lessons yet. So I still continue to do this stuff, and I'm a hardcore recidivist. So 8 of us, the recidivists, were going to go on trial there. And I know the prosecutors in Alexandria, and eventually they dropped the charges against us. But what the issue we were raising with the letter that we sent to the Pentagon, we always do this, we send a letter to some high authority, we ask for a meeting, we never get a response, we never get a meeting. So we then go to the site thinking this might work better. We're actually on site, and the people are present. So they decided, the Pentagon, for whatever reason, I have no idea, they dropped the charges against us. But the issue that we were raising, and I urge you very, very much to get a copy, if you've never seen this, Joseph Nevins, he's a professor, Uncommon Dreams, June 14th, 2010. If you haven't read this article called Greenwashing the Pentagon, it's required reading. He makes the argument that the Pentagon is #1 for committing ecocide. Humvees allegedly get 8 miles to the gallon. Imagine driving a Humvee in Afghanistan. It's cut down to 4 miles. I think he says that they burn up 330,000 gallons of oil a day, and on and on and on. So we wrote this. We said we want to talk about this matter because this is urgent. It's bringing in concerns of your warmongering, but also your destruction of the planet. I have tried repeatedly in my travels to convince the environmental movement to link up with the anti-war movement. No success. So if anybody here's got any ideas when you do the Q&A, please let me know where to go, who to talk to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As I said, I'm an amateur historian. I was looking at something that the Joan House put out. They used to put out a newspaper called Year One. And Susan Crane just got arrested on Good Friday out in California. Plowshares activist, used to live here in Baltimore. She wrote a piece about a Rivers of Blood action at the US Capitol. And there were, I believe it was 26 of us, went into the crypt of the US Capitol. Anybody ever been to the crypt of the US Capitol? It's a perfect place to do a die-in. So we all had bloody shirts on, and at the appropriate moment, I was designated to be the first one. I named a person from Iraq that was killed, and then I died in the crypt. And then each person around the did the same thing. And it was, you know, these things happen, who knows why, but there happened to be a high school theater group there that day. And so there was a teacher there, and she's telling the students, now see how this is working? See, they're doing street theater right here in the US Capitol. This photograph that Susan included in the year one was Peter DeMott, now deceased, and Susan Crane holding our banner, Rivers of Blood. And sadly, to report, 2 people from that action are now deceased. But some of us have to continue to carry on these resistance actions. I've got a couple things to say before I close. If you get a chance, read the book, Bury the Chains. It's a great book by Adam Hochschild. And I saw him, his latest book was about British resistors in World War I, which is a great read. So I saw him down at Politics and Prose, April of 2011. And I told him this during Q&A. But he more or less ends the book. And the book is about how first Britain ended the slave trade and then ended slavery. Obviously no Civil War involved, etc. And he ends the book with, which I didn't know, Frederick Douglass, great Frederick Douglass, and William Lloyd Garrison go to London. And who do they meet with? But they meet with Thomas Clarkson. If you've seen the great movie Amazing Grace tells you that William Wilberforce was the person that ended slavery in Britain. Well, it's actually Thomas Clarkson who was the one that did all the work, a Quaker, that did all the heavy lifting. You'll see a scene in the movie where they roll out this roll of paper with all these signatures. Imagine in the 18th century gathering petitions on horseback, going all around. They gathered over 1 million signatures. There's a great scene in the film. So they meet with Thomas Clarkson so he can give them some advice on doing the same thing in the United States. And then Clarkson dies two years later. It's so important that we continue these traditions. Anybody that gets an email from me, I always have down at the bottom, I quote from Eugene Victor Debs, one of my great heroes. And this is the quote I always have at the bottom of my emails. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. The master class has all to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has had nothing to gain and everything to lose, especially their lives. On end of June, we haven't selected a date yet, we're going to the Central Intelligence Agency because the Central Intelligence Agency is involved in the use of killer drones. We would argue vociferously that the use of killer drones by our government is illegal. So we're going to go there. There will be people risking arrest. Anybody who wants to get more information about this, just let me know. I will keep you informed. We'll be drafting a letter. We're going to be sending a letter to Brennan. I think David was there that day, but I had the good fortune to be there when Brennan first appeared before the Senate committee, and it was a classic. It was a classic. Imagine a room bigger than this, and I don't know how many protesters rose up when he got to the bench to try to testify, and people had signs and blood, and 8 people.
There too.
Ann was there. There was 8 arrests that day. They're still going through the trial system in Washington. And so when we get to court, we try to raise these issues that there's crimes being committed. We're here to help you out. We're providing information that you should jump on. So what we decided to do with the CIA is, prior to the action, we're going to both the prosecutor's office, and we're also going to go to a court commissioner down there, and we're going to have a complaint that there's criminal activity. It's being done just down the road here in Fairfax County. And I'm not naive. I don't think we're going to get a wild reception. I don't think the court commissioner is going to take our complaint. in indictment, et cetera, and say, yes, we'll jump right on it. I don't think the prosecutor's going to, but these are part of the process. We try to follow the law. That's all we do. We try to follow the law. The law says you can't kill U.S. citizens with, due process, but they seem to get away with this, and we try to speak out in court. My final quote from the great Thomas Merton. I am on the side of the people who are being burned, cut to pieces, tortured, held as hostages, gassed, ruined, destroyed. They are the victims of both sides. To take sides with massive power is to take sides against the innocent. The side I take is then the side of the people who are sick of war and want peace in order to rebuild their country. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope we have a vigorous dialogue, Q&A, and if you have any questions of any of us, please